The halls of MIT buzzed with excitement as people filed into the grand lecture hall. It was the first day of the International Mathematics Conference, an event that brought together the brightest minds in the field. Men and women in blazers and button-ups chatted eagerly, their conference badges swinging from lanyards around their necks. Some carried laptops, others clutched notebooks filled with scribbled equations. They all shared the same look, confident, educated, like they belonged. In the back of the room, Eli wiped his brow with a handkerchief. He wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. As he adjusted his ill-fitting dress shirt, bought secondhand for this very occasion, he felt like an imposter among these professors and math geniuses. His hands, rough from years of manual labor, fidgeted with the program booklet. At 24, Eli Reyes spent his nights pushing a mop across these same halls. While students and faculty went home to comfortable beds, he cleaned their classrooms, emptied their trash bins, and wiped down their whiteboards, careful never to erase the complex equations that fascinated him so deeply. "You sure you want to use your day off for this?" His supervisor had asked when he requested the schedule change. "It's just a bunch of folks talking about math problems nobody can solve." But to Eli, it was everything. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the crowd. Professor James Chen, a legend in the field of applied mathematics, took the stage. His silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses gave him an air of wisdom that commanded respect from everyone in the room. Everyone except a group of young doctoral candidates seated near the front, who whispered and chuckled amongst themselves. "Welcome to our special session on unsolved problems in computational complexity," Chen began, his voice carrying throughout the hall. "Today we'll be examining the infamous P versus NP problem, which continues to elude even our best minds." Eli leaned forward in his seat. The P versus NP problem. He'd read about it in a discarded textbook he'd found while cleaning the computer science department. For months, he'd filled notebook after notebook with his thoughts on it, working through equations during lunch breaks and before his shift started. As Professor Chen explained the problem using colorful slides and accessible examples, Eli found himself nodding along. This wasn't new information to him. In fact, he'd spent countless nights thinking about this very topic while the campus slept around him. "The million-dollar question," Chen continued, "is whether every problem whose solution can be quickly verified can also be quickly solved. If P equals NP, the implications would revolutionize everything from internet security to medical research." The professor clicked to a slide showing a particular approach that had stumped researchers. Eli frowned. He could see the flaw immediately. They were overcomplicating it, missing an elegant solution that seemed obvious to him. Without thinking, Eli raised his hand. The professor paused, looking surprised to see a question so early in his presentation. "Yes?" The gentleman in the back. Suddenly, all eyes turned to Eli. He swallowed hard, instantly regretting his impulse. He was wearing jeans, for goodness sake, clean but worn. Nothing like the pressed khakis and slacks surrounding him. "I was wondering," Eli began, his voice cracking slightly, "if anyone has tried approaching it through graph theory instead? If you represent the problem as a special type of network, couldn't you apply the theorem from last year's paper by Rodriguez to simplify the verification step?" The silence that followed felt eternal. Then, like a dam breaking, laughter rippled through the audience. Not from everyone. Some looked confused, others merely curious, but enough to make Eli's face burn with shame. One of the doctoral students up front turned to his friends. "Did the janitor just try to solve P versus NP?" He stage whispered, prompting more snickers. Professor Chen cleared his throat. "That's an interesting thought," he said kindly, though his expression betrayed confusion about who exactly was asking the question. "Rodriguez's work deals with a different class of problems altogether, but thank you for your enthusiasm." He moved on quickly, but Eli barely heard the rest of the talk. Blood pounded in his ears as he stared at his hands, wishing he could disappear. How could he have been so stupid? Of course, Rodriguez's theorem wasn't directly applicable. Eli had only read the abstract of that paper, not the full text, since academic journals weren't exactly light reading available at the public library. When the session ended for a coffee break, Eli didn't move. People filed past him, some glancing curiously in his direction. He heard fragments of conversation. Who was that guy? And probably some undergrad who wandered into the wrong room. As the crowd thinned, a woman approached his row. Dr. Martha Wilson. He recognized her immediately. He emptied her office trash every night, careful never to disturb the stacks of papers on her desk. She taught advanced calculus and always left encouraging notes on her students' work. He'd read some of them while cleaning, wishing someone had spoken to him that way when he was struggling through high school math. "Hey there," she said, sitting down next to him. That was a bold question. Eli stared at his shoes. It was a stupid question. "No such thing as a stupid question in mathematics," she replied, her voice warm. "Just incomplete ones. I'm Dr. Wilson." "I know," Eli said, then quickly added, I've seen your name on the office directory. I'm Eli." "Nice to meet you, Eli. Are you a student here?" "I don't think I've seen you in any of the math department courses." The question made his stomach tighten. "No, I work here." "Oh, in which department?" He hesitated. "Facilities management." Understanding dawned in her eyes. "You're on the cleaning staff?" He nodded, waiting for the judgment, the dismissal, the awkward exit. Instead, she smiled. "And you're interested in computational complexity?" "That's fantastic." Eli looked up, surprised by her genuine tone. "I read a lot." "Whenever I can." "Self-taught?" "Even more impressive." She glanced toward the stage where Professor Chen was chatting with a group of attendees. Your question wasn't entirely off base. The approach needs refinement, but the intuition behind it shows real insight." For the first time since the laughter had erupted, Eli felt something other than embarrassment, a small flicker of pride. "The conference runs all week," Dr. Wilson continued. "You should come back tomorrow. There's a workshop on emerging approaches that might interest you." Before Eli could respond, one of her colleagues called her name. She stood fishing a business card from her pocket. "Here. Email me if you have any questions about the materials or sessions." With a warm smile, she added, "And don't let the laughter get to you." Half the breakthroughs in mathematics came from questions everyone else thought were ridiculous. As she walked away, Eli turned the business card over in his hands. He hadn't expected kindness today. He'd expected to sit quietly, absorb what he could, and go back to his invisible life. Later that evening, as the conference attendees headed to a fancy dinner at a nearby restaurant, Eli changed into his gray work uniform in the small janitor's closet that served as his locker room. He could hear them through the walls, talking excitedly about the day's presentations, making plans to collaborate on papers, sharing jokes he didn't understand. He pushed his cleaning cart past the lecture hall where he'd been humiliated hours earlier. The whiteboard still showed some of Professor Chen's equations. Eli paused, glancing around to make sure he was alone, then picked up a marker. Carefully, he added a small notation in the corner of the board, a tiny adjustment to one of the approaches discussed. He stepped back, looking at his addition. It probably wouldn't make any difference. No one would even notice it. And if they did, they'd erase it without a second thought. Who would believe the janitor had anything valuable to add? As he moved on to clean the rest of the building, Eli didn't notice Dr. Wilson standing in the doorway, watching him with thoughtful eyes. That night, in his tiny apartment above a convenience store, Eli sat cross-legged on his bed surrounded by library books and printed articles. His walls were covered with papers, not posters of bands or movies, but hand-copied equations and theories he couldn't afford to print. A small desk lamp cast a warm glow over his notebook where he was working through a new idea, inspired by something he'd heard at the conference. The laughter still stung. But as he worked through the problem step by step, finding a rhythm in the dance of symbols and logic, he felt something stronger than shame: determination. One day, they wouldn't laugh. One day, they would listen. He worked until dawn broke over the city skyline, the golden light catching the edges of the papers on his wall, illuminating equations that might, just might, change everything. The moon cast long shadows across the empty hallways of MIT's mathematics building as Eli pushed his cart from room to room. It was just past midnight, his favorite time of night. The campus slept, and in that silence he found a kind of freedom. 3 weeks had passed since the embarrassing incident at the conference. 3 weeks of keeping his head down, avoiding eye contact with professors, and pretending he hadn't made a fool of himself in front of the entire mathematics department. Room 317 needs extra attention tonight, his supervisor had told him at the start of his shift. Some big meeting happened there today. Lots of coffee spills and crumpled papers. Eli nodded, already knowing which room it was. Professor Chen's classroom where the weekly department meetings were held. He'd memorized every professor's room number, not because he needed to for his job, but because he'd spent hours listening outside their doors during lectures, soaking up knowledge like a sponge. When he finally reached room 317, he found exactly what he expected. Chairs askew, coffee cups abandoned on desks, and the large whiteboard covered in equations. But these weren't just any equations. Eli's heart quickened as he realized what he was looking at. The department was working on a variation of the same problem discussed at the conference, the P versus NP problem, but with a specific application to cryptography. Red and blue markers had been used to highlight different approaches, with question marks and crossed-out sections showing where they'd hit walls. Eli set down his mop and stepped closer to the board, his eyes tracing the elegant dance of symbols. He could see where they were struggling. The approach was clever but overcomplicated. They were missing something fundamental, something simple. He reached for the black marker before he could stop himself. Then he hesitated, his hand hovering in the air. Last time he'd tried to contribute, he'd been laughed at. Who was he to think he could solve what these brilliant professors couldn't? Just a janitor with a high school diploma. A nobody. He put the marker down and started cleaning the room instead. He emptied trash bins, wiped down desks, and vacuumed the carpet. All the while, the equations called to him like an unfinished song. The missing notes so clear in his mind he could almost hear them. When he finished cleaning, he stood in the doorway looking back at the whiteboard. He should leave it alone. He should move on to the next room and forget about it. Instead, he closed the door behind him, picked up the marker, and began to write. His hand moved quickly, adding notations to their work, suggesting a different path through the mathematical maze they'd created. He wasn't erasing anything they'd done, just offering a bridge over the gaps they hadn't been able to cross. When he finished, he stepped back, heart pounding. What had he done? He'd overstepped. If anyone found out, he might lose his job. Who asked the janitor to solve math problems? In a sudden panic, he grabbed the eraser, ready to wipe away his additions. But as he raised it to the board, the door opened. Forgot my... Dr. Wilson stopped mid-sentence, staring at Eli with the eraser in his hand. Her eyes darted to the whiteboard, taking in the new additions. What are you doing? Eli lowered the eraser, his throat dry. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have touched it. I'll erase it right now. Wait. She held up a hand, moving closer to the board. Her eyes narrowed as she studied his work. Following the logic of his additions, for what felt like an eternity, she said nothing. Then quietly, You did this? He nodded, bracing himself for anger, for accusations, for dismissal. This is... She traced one of his equations with her finger. This is remarkably insightful. You've connected Rodriguez's theorem with Tuan's network approach. I don't think anyone has tried that combination before. Eli blinked, not sure he'd heard her correctly. You're not mad? Dr. Wilson turned to look at him. Really look at him, as if seeing past the gray uniform to the person underneath. Why would I be mad at brilliant thinking? Though I'm curious. Where did you learn this level of mathematics? You said you weren't a student here. The question made him uncomfortable. His path to knowledge wasn't traditional or impressive. I listen to lectures sometimes while I'm cleaning, and I read whatever I can get my hands on. You learned this just by listening and reading on your own? He shrugged, embarrassed by her amazement. Math makes sense to me. Always has. Even in high school, when I was failing everything else, math was clear. Dr. Wilson pulled up a chair and gestured for him to do the same. Hesitantly, Eli sat down, acutely aware that his cleaning cart was still in the hallway and that he was falling behind on his rounds. Tell me more, she said simply. And somehow, in that empty classroom at 1 a.m, Eli found himself telling this professor things he'd never told anyone. How he'd grown up in a neighborhood where academic success wasn't just uncommon, it was viewed with suspicion. How he'd hidden his math books inside comic book covers so he wouldn't get teased. How his high school counselor had laughed when he'd mentioned dreams of college, pointing to his failing grades in every subject but math. My mom got sick my sophomore year, he explained. I started missing school to take care of her, then to work extra jobs. By the time I graduated, my GPA was so bad no college would look at me. But I never stopped learning. Dr. Wilson listened without interrupting, her expression thoughtful. When he finally ran out of words, she was quiet for a moment. I have a proposal for you, she said. What if you continued your work on this problem but not in secret? What if you collaborated with me? Eli stared at her. Why would you want to work with me? Because talent shouldn't be wasted and because that approach you sketched out might actually lead somewhere important. She gestured to the whiteboard. That's not the work of someone who should be pushing a mop at night. That's the work of a mathematician. The word hit him like a physical force. Mathematician. No one had ever used that word to describe him before. I don't have time, he said weakly. I work 2 jobs, and I wouldn't even know where to start with formal research. Start by emailing me your thoughts on this problem. I'll help guide your reading, suggest resources. She stood up, decision made. And if this leads where I think it might, we'll find a way to make the time. After she left, Eli stood alone in the classroom, staring at the equations on the board. His equations, mingled with those of respected professors. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine a different future than the one he'd resigned himself to. The next evening, he arrived at work to find a package waiting for him in the janitor's office. Inside was a brand new notebook, 3 advanced textbooks on computational complexity, and a note from Dr. Wilson. Start here. Page 394 connects directly to your approach. MW. For the next 2 weeks, Eli lived a double life. By day, he worked at a package delivery service, loading trucks in a warehouse across town. By night, he cleaned the university buildings. But in between, in stolen moments during lunch breaks and the quiet hours before dawn, he dove into the books Dr. Wilson had given him. He filled the notebook with ideas, questions, and attempts at proofs. Some nights he'd find small notes left on his cart, articles printed out for him, questions about specific aspects of his work, suggestions for new approaches to try. Dr. Wilson never treated their unusual collaboration as charity or as something strange. She treated him like a colleague. On Friday night, Eli arrived at work to find the campus unusually active. Lights were on in the mathematics building and people in formal attire streamed into the main lecture hall. What's happening? He asked a security guard he knew. Some big-shot professor from Stanford is giving a talk, the guard explained. Supposed to be a major deal in the math world. Curious, Eli wheeled his cart past the lecture hall, slowing to peer through the doors. The room was packed, with people even standing along the walls. At the podium stood a tall woman with short gray hair, pointing at a projection screen that showed, Eli's heart nearly stopped, the exact problem he'd been working on with Dr. Wilson. Dr. Fernandez believes this problem is the key to cracking a whole class of encryption methods, someone near the door was saying. If she's right, it could revolutionize cybersecurity. Eli couldn't help himself. He slipped into the back of the hall, standing in the shadows where no one would notice the janitor in gray. The speaker was explaining why traditional approaches had failed, detailing the same roadblocks he'd seen on the whiteboard 3 weeks ago. The critical question, Dr. Fernandez concluded, is whether we can find a bridge between Rodriguez's network theory and the verification algorithms developed by Chen's team here at MIT. So far, this connection has proven elusive. Eli felt a strange sensation in his chest, a certainty, a clarity. He had found that bridge. It was sitting in his notebook right now, refined over weeks of late-night work guided by Dr. Wilson's feedback. As if summoned by his thoughts, he spotted Dr. Wilson in the 3rd row, turning in her seat to scan the crowd. When she caught sight of him, she gave a small, encouraging nod. After the lecture, people gathered in the atrium for wine and cheese. Eli should have been cleaning the upper floors by now, but instead, he hovered at the edges of the reception, watching. Dr. Wilson was deep in conversation with the visiting speaker and Professor Chen, gesturing animatedly about something. Then she looked up, spotted him, and waved him over. Every instinct told him to run. He didn't belong in this crowd of blazers and evening dresses with his gray uniform and name tag. But Dr. Wilson's expression was insistent. Swallowing his fear, he approached the small group. "This is my colleague I was telling you about," Dr. Wilson said casually, as if introducing another professor. "Eli Reyes. He's been developing a novel approach to the problem you presented tonight." Dr. Fernandez raised an eyebrow, her gaze cool and assessing as she took in his uniform. "You work in maintenance?" "Yes," Eli said, forcing himself to meet her eyes. "But I also work in mathematics." But Chen was still staring at the whiteboard. tracing Eli's equations with his eyes. "Remarkable," he said softly. Then louder. "This approach deserves serious consideration. Dr. Wilson, how much of this work is verifiable?" "All of it," she replied confidently. "Eli has filled 3 notebooks with detailed proofs. I've reviewed them myself, and while some sections need formal refinement, the core insight is sound." The graduate student who had spoken earlier raised his hand. "But he's a janitor," he said, not unkindly but with genuine confusion. How did he develop a breakthrough approach that 3 research teams missed?" Dr. Wilson finished for him. "By thinking differently, by coming to the problem without the constraints of traditional training." Eli stood awkwardly at the front, unsure whether to return to his seat or continue. Professor Chen seemed to sense his discomfort. "Mr. Reyes, would you be willing to walk us through the middle section again? I'm particularly interested in how you're handling the boundary conditions." For the next hour, the meeting transformed into something Eli had never experienced before, a genuine intellectual discussion where his ideas were taken seriously. Professors asked him questions, challenged specific points, suggested refinements. Not once did anyone mention his job or lack of credentials. They engaged with his mind, not his status. When the session finally ended, several people approached him, asking about specific aspects of his work or offering suggestions for further development. Dr. Zhang, who had questioned his credentials earlier, handed him a business card. "If this pans out," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind, "you should consider applying to our graduate program. Talent like yours shouldn't go to waste." As the room slowly emptied, Eli gathered his notes, feeling dazed. Professor Chen approached him last, his expression thoughtful. "You know," Chen said quietly, "I remember your question at the conference now. About Rodriguez's theorem." He shook his head. "I dismissed it too quickly. I apologize for that." Eli wasn't sure how to respond. "It's fine," he said finally. "My question wasn't well formulated." "Perhaps not," Chen agreed. "But the intuition behind it was sound, as you've demonstrated today." He paused. "Dr. Wilson tells me you've had no formal training beyond high school mathematics." "That's right. Then what you've accomplished is all the more impressive." Chen seemed to be considering something. "Our department has a special scholarship program, rarely used but designed for exceptional cases. I'd like to discuss the possibility of your enrollment as a special student." Eli stared at him, not sure he'd heard correctly. "You want me to study here? As a student?" "To start," Chen said with a nod. "Where it leads after that would depend on your work. But based on what I've seen today, I suspect it could lead quite far." After Chen left, Eli sat alone in the empty classroom, trying to process everything that had happened. His phone alarm buzzed, a reminder that his night shift was about to start. In 15 minutes, he was supposed to be pushing a mop down the same hallway where professors had just shaken his hand and asked for his insights. The contrast was dizzying as he headed to the janitor's closet to change into his uniform. He passed a group of graduate students still discussing the meeting. They fell silent when they saw him. Then one stepped forward, the same student who had questioned him earlier. "That was really impressive," he said, extending his hand. "I'm Alex, by the way. I'm working on a related problem for my dissertation. Would you be interested in getting coffee sometime to discuss your approach in more detail?" Eli shook his hand, a strange new confidence flowing through him. "I'd like that. I'm usually free in the afternoons before my shift." "Great," Alex replied with a genuine smile. "I'll email you. Dr. Wilson gave us your contact information. Hope that's okay." As they walked away, Eli heard one of them say, "Can you believe no one spotted that connection before? And a janitor found it." But there was no mockery in the voice, only admiration. That night, as he mopped floors and emptied trash, Eli moved through the building with a different energy. For the first time, he felt seen, not just as the invisible person who cleaned up after everyone else, but as a mind with something valuable to contribute. His phone buzzed with an email notification. Dr. Fernandez from Stanford, responding to the summary of today's meeting that Professor Chen had sent her. Extraordinary approach. Will need rigorous verification, but potentially groundbreaking if it holds. Please convey my congratulations to Mr. Reyes. Would be very interested in discussing further when I return to MIT next month. Eli leaned on his mop, reading the message twice to make sure he hadn't misunderstood. Dr. Fernandez, whose work he'd studied reverently for months, wanted to discuss his ideas. With him, directly. He looked around at the empty hallway, at the cleaning cart that had been his companion for 3 years of night shifts. Soon this might not be his world anymore. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. As he resumed his cleaning, a line from one of his library books came back to him. Something about mathematics being the great equalizer, where the only currency that mattered was the quality of one's ideas. For most of his life, he'd thought that was a comforting fiction, a nice story that ignored the very real barriers of money, connections, and credentials. But today, for a few hours at least, it had been true. In that room, he hadn't been the janitor. He'd been a mathematician, and no one had laughed. Word spread quickly through the mathematics department about the janitor who solved the unsolvable problem. By the time Eli arrived for his shift the next evening, the story had grown to mythic proportions. He heard whispers as he pushed his cart down the hallway. Some graduate students even nodded at him in recognition, a strange new experience after years of invisibility. "Is it true?" his supervisor asked when he checked in. "Pete from security said you were giving some kind of lecture to the math professors yesterday." Eli shifted uncomfortably. "Not exactly a lecture. I was just explaining some ideas I've been working on." His supervisor shook his head in amazement. "Always knew you were different, reading those complicated books during your breaks. Never figured you for some kind of math genius, though." "I'm not a genius," Eli protested. "I just think about problems differently sometimes." "Well, whatever you are, someone important wants to see you." He handed Eli a note. Dean of Sciences stopped by personally to leave this. The note was brief. "Mr. Reyes, please come to my office tomorrow at 10 a.m. to discuss your future at this institution. Dean Hopkins." Eli stared at the paper, his heart racing. The Dean of Sciences wanted to meet with him? About his future? He'd never even seen the dean before, let alone spoken to him. "I'll have to miss my morning job," he said, more to himself than his supervisor. "Way I hear it. You might not need that job much longer," his supervisor replied with a smile. "Not if they're offering you some fancy research position." The idea seemed so far-fetched that Eli almost laughed. Him with a research position? Just yesterday, he'd been scrubbing toilets and mopping floors. Today, people were acting like he was some kind of hidden genius discovered in their midst. The reality was more complicated. Yes, he'd found an elegant solution to a difficult problem, but he still lacked the formal training, the credentials, the background that everyone else in this building took for granted. One clever insight didn't erase years of educational disadvantage. As he made his rounds that night, Eli found himself lingering in front of office doors, reading the nameplates and credentials. Dr. Such-and-Such, Ph.D., Yale University. Professor So-and-so, Department Chair, double Ph.D., MIT. Each brass plate represented years of dedicated study, countless papers written, exams passed, qualifications earned. What would his nameplate say? Eli Reyes, high school graduate, self-taught? He was so lost in these thoughts that he almost didn't notice Dr. Wilson waiting for him outside the physics building. "I figured I'd find you here," she said, falling into step beside him as he pushed his cart. "Have you heard from the dean yet?" Eli nodded. "Meeting tomorrow morning. Do you know what it's about?" "I have a pretty good idea." Her smile was mysterious. "Let's just say several of us have been advocating on your behalf. Dr. Wilson, I appreciate everything you've done, but..." He stopped walking, turning to face her directly. "This is happening too fast. Yesterday I was just a janitor. Today people are looking at me differently, expecting things from me. What if I can't live up to it?" She studied him for a moment. "You're afraid. Of course I'm afraid. I don't belong in this world. I didn't go to college. I don't have degrees. I don't know the right terminology or the history of the field or..." "You solved a problem that stumped people who have all those things," she interrupted gently. "That counts for something. One lucky insight doesn't make me a mathematician." "No," she agreed, "but it might open the door to becoming one officially. Isn't that what you want?" The question hit him hard. What did he want? For years he'd lived in two worlds, the physical world of mops and trash cans and paychecks that barely covered rent, and the mental world of equations and theorems and the pure, clean joy of solving puzzles. He'd never dared to imagine those worlds could merge. I don't know if I can do it, he admitted. Go back to school, start all over. I'm 24. Most of these graduate students have been studying math continuously since they were kids. And yet you solve something they couldn't. She shrugged. Look, no one's saying it will be easy. You have gaps in your knowledge that will take time to fill. But you also have insights that can't be taught, a fresh perspective that sees connections others miss. From down the hall came the sound of laughter, a group of students leaving a late study session. Eli instinctively stepped back, positioning his cart against the wall, making himself smaller, less noticeable. The habit of invisibility was hard to break, Dr. Wilson noticed. That right there, she said quietly after the students passed. That's what would be the biggest waste. Not just your mathematical talent, but the way you've been taught to hide it, to believe it doesn't belong here. She put a hand on his arm. It does belong here. You belong here. Her words stayed with him as he finished his shift, as he rode the bus back to his tiny apartment, as he lay awake staring at the ceiling. You belong here. Could it really be true? The next morning, Eli stood outside the dean's office wearing the best clothes he owned, still woefully inadequate compared to the suits and ties that passed him in the hallway. He'd called in sick to his day job, the first time he'd ever missed a shift. His palms were sweaty as he knocked on the heavy wooden door. Come in, called a deep voice. Dean Hopkins was a tall man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes. His office was exactly what Eli had imagined. Wood-paneled walls lined with books, diplomas, and awards. A massive desk dominated the space behind which sat the dean and, to Eli's surprise, Professor Chen and Dr. Wilson. Mr. Reyes, the dean said, rising to shake his hand. Please have a seat. We have much to discuss. Eli sat down awkwardly, feeling like an imposter in the plush leather chair. Thank you for meeting with me, sir. No, thank you for coming. The dean's smile was warm but evaluating. I've heard quite a remarkable story about you. Professor Chen and Dr. Wilson have been singing your praises rather enthusiastically. Eli glanced at them, feeling a surge of gratitude. They've been very supportive. Tell me, Mr. Reyes, the dean continued, leaning forward. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Still working as part of our maintenance staff? The question caught him off guard. I haven't really thought that far ahead, sir. Perhaps it's time you did. The dean picked up a folder from his desk. I've reviewed the work you did on the encryption problem. I'm not a mathematician myself, but I'm told it represents a significant breakthrough. Professor Chen nodded. It does indeed. Mr. Reyes has a unique intuition for connections that others miss. So I've been told. The dean opened the folder. I've also looked into your background. You graduated from Westside High School with a 2.3 GPA, except for mathematics where you maintained a perfect 4.0 despite frequent absences. No college education, no formal training beyond high school level, and yet somehow you've managed to teach yourself advanced computational theory and contribute meaningfully to a cutting-edge research problem. He looked up. That's quite extraordinary. Eli shifted in his seat, unsure how to respond. I like math. It makes sense to me. Well, it clearly more than makes sense to you. The dean closed the folder. MIT has a tradition of recognizing exceptional talent regardless of its source. We also have certain programs designed for unconventional cases. Dr. Wilson leaned forward. We're proposing a special admission to our advanced studies program with a full scholarship. Eli stared at her, then at the dean. You want me to be a student here? But I don't have the prerequisites, the background courses, which is why we're suggesting a customized program, Professor Chen interjected. You would take some undergraduate courses to fill gaps in your formal knowledge, while simultaneously pursuing the advanced work you're clearly capable of. Dr. Wilson has agreed to serve as your primary advisor. The dean nodded. It's unusual but not unprecedented. MIT has occasionally admitted exceptional individuals through non-traditional paths. Eli's mind was spinning. A scholarship. A chance to study formally, to put his name on papers, to pursue mathematics without having to squeeze it into the margins of his life. I would have to quit my jobs, he said slowly. The scholarship would cover tuition and include a stipend for living expenses, the dean assured him. You wouldn't need to work, at least not as a janitor. We might ask you to serve as a teaching assistant once you've settled in. And my solution? The work I've been doing with Dr. Wilson? Professor Chen smiled. That would become your first official research project. We already have interest from the cybersecurity community, and potentially from government agencies working on encryption standards. If your approach holds up under further testing, it could be quite significant. For a moment, Eli couldn't speak. It was too much, too fast. Everything he'd secretly dreamed of but never believed possible suddenly laid before him like a feast after years of starvation. "Why?" he finally asked. "Why go to all this trouble for me?" The three academics exchanged glances. It was Dr. Wilson who answered. "Because talent like yours is rare and it would be a crime to waste it." She smiled. "And because science advances when we bring in new perspectives, new ways of thinking. You see connections that we miss precisely because you weren't trained in our traditions and constraints. There's a practical element as well," the dean added candidly. "Discoveries like yours bring recognition and funding to the university. We'd be foolish to let you and your ideas walk out the door." Eli looked down at his hands, the calloused hands of a janitor who had spent years cleaning up after people like the one sitting across from him. Now they were offering him a place among them. Not as an equal, not yet, but as someone with the potential to become one. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Say yes," Dr. Wilson urged. "Take the chance." 2 hours later, Eli walked across the campus in a daze, a folder of paperwork clutched in his hands. Conditional admission letters, financial aid forms, course catalogs. A new life contained in manila and staples. Students passed him on all sides, hurrying to classes or lounging on the grass, laughing and talking. Soon he would be one of them. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. His phone buzzed, a text from his supervisor at the cleaning company. "Heard the news. Congratulations, kid. Always knew you were too smart for this job." News traveled fast. Eli wondered how many people knew already. How many were talking about him, the janitor who solved an unsolvable problem and got offered a scholarship as a result. As he approached the mathematics building, he saw a familiar face, Alex, the graduate student who had spoken to him after his presentation. "Hey," Alex called, jogging over. "I've been trying to reach you. Did you get my email about getting coffee to discuss your approach?" Eli shook his head. "Sorry, I've been caught up in meetings all morning. But yes, I'd like that," Alex grinned. "Great, even more reason to talk now. Word is you're joining the department officially?" "Looks that way." Eli held up the folder. "Still seems unreal. Well, a bunch of us are going to the campus coffee shop now to brainstorm on the problem. Want to join? Dr. Patel and Dr. Zhang might stop by too. An invitation to join other researchers, to be included in their discussions as a peer rather than an outsider." Eli felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest. "Actually, yeah, I'd like that." As they walked together toward the coffee shop, Alex asked him about his background, how he'd become interested in mathematics, how he'd developed his approach to the problem. For the first time, Eli found himself telling his story without shame or apology, not as a hard-luck tale, but simply as his path. The coffee shop was crowded with students, but Alex's friends had saved them seats. As Eli sat down among them, he felt oddly at home. They jumped straight into discussion of the problem, asking his opinion, challenging his assumptions, building on his ideas. No one mentioned his job or his lack of credentials. They engaged with his mind, his thoughts, his mathematical reasoning. The key insight, Eli found himself explaining, sketching diagrams on a napkin, is that we don't need to solve the whole problem at once. If we break it into this specific pattern of subproblems, each one becomes manageable. One of the students, a young woman with bright eyes and quick questions, pointed to his diagram. "But how do you know this decomposition will work for all instances of the problem?" "That's the beauty of it," Eli replied, feeling the familiar excitement of mathematical discovery. "We can prove that for this class of encryption algorithms, this pattern will always emerge. Here, let me show you." As he launched into an explanation, surrounded by people who spoke his language and valued his insights, Eli realized something important. He hadn't changed overnight from a janitor to a mathematician. The truth was he had always been both. The janitor was what he did to survive. The mathematician was who he had always been inside. Now, finally, the world was beginning to see what he had always known about himself. Later that evening, as the group finally broke up, Eli found himself walking back across campus with Alex. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the buildings where he had spent so many nights alone with his mop and his thoughts.